وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. So last week we talked about Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu had an illness for 30 years and he was bedridden because of it and died shortly after he got this treatment done called Qay, which is makruh, as mentioned in the ahadith. But Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam himself had that treatment done upon one of the Sahaba, as I mentioned last week. So it's not mamnu', it's not haram. It's just makruh, it's reprehensible. So he got it done, and then 2 years later he passed away. And so the last thing we talked about was his passing away. And because of that, some of our brothers came to me and said, oh, we're starting a new Sahabi today. But since this was more related to the illness than to his death, therefore I mentioned it. But really there's a little bit more to go on about this great Sahabi of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So we'll continue inshallah, and most likely we'll be able to finish with Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu in this session. So before we begin the next part, one thing we need to understand about Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu, in fact about all the Sahaba, after Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam passed away, who became the elders of the communities, wherever they went? The Sahaba. So everybody looked up to them, everybody revered them. And everybody watched them carefully regarding whatever decisions they made, whatever movement they made even, because they were kind of reflections of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. People would watch them very carefully. Any decisions they would make would be adopted by the people in their community. So Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu lived in Basra. So the community in Basra had a lot of respect and reverence for him. Because of that, the politicians in Basra, the governor and other people in high positions, wanted Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu on their side, because to have Imran ibn Husayn on their side would mean to have the people on their side. But that was very hard for him, because sometimes you're in a position where if the governor or somebody in a high position tells you to do something, you don't do it. In those days, they didn't have lawyers. They just what? Got rid of you, right? So he had a choice. He was worried that if he was to take such a position, and he was offered it on multiple occasions, that if he was to take such a position, he would be between a rock and a hard place, so to say. Either he chooses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and does the right thing, which means he causes the anger of his employers, the governor, or he chooses to do what they want and then he destroys his akhirah. So because of that, he was given a position, he took it, but he also immediately resigned. And this happened not on one occasion, but more than one occasion. But before that, there's one other thing that I want to mention, and that was going back to what we talked about, that Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu, like all the other Sahaba, was the head of his community. So people used to take him very seriously. He was the leader of Basra. Basra became a big hub for supporters of Aisha Siddiqa Radiallahu Anha shortly before the battle between Ali ibn Abi Talib and Aisha Siddiqa, the unfortunate battle that took place in history. Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu used to say, and this is one of his narrations, he says, this is narrated by one of the tabi'in, he says, I used to see Imran ibn Husayn yuhidd an-nazra ila Ali ibn Abi Talib. He used to always look and stare at Ali ibn Abi Talib, stare at him. So somebody asked him, why are you always looking at him, staring at him? So he said, I heard Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam say, an-nadhru ila aliyin ibadah. To look at Ali is a form of ibadah. We find similar hadith about Umar ibn Khattab Radiallahu Anhu in Hayatul Sahaba, where Ibn Abbas Radiallahu Anhu says that to sit in the company of Umar Radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and this was the time when he was Amir al-Mu'mineen, is like sitting in the company of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because if you remember, we read in all the khutbat of Jum'ah, Man ahabbahum fa bihubbi ahabbahum. Whoever loves them, he loves them because of their love for me. So anybody who loves Sahaba, it's an indication of their intense and immense love for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And anybody who loves Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is also a sign of his love for, similarly his sign of his love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, to be sitting in the gathering of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majmain was a form of ibadah. And that chain continues to this day. If there are sadiqeen around, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us hukum that they are a continuation of that chain of pious people. If you sit in their company, sitting in their company is a form of ibadah. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kunu ma'a sadiqeen. Sit with the sadiqeen, because that is a form of ibadah. Even if you don't actually perform any ibadah, sitting in the gathering itself becomes a form of ibadah. Now, because of this hadith, I can't say for sure, but it seems like Imran ibn Husayn radiallahu anhu was inclined towards Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu because of this hadith, because of during that time when there was friction between Ali ibn Abi Talib and the other side, the other party of Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majmain. But still, despite that, he refused to get involved in the feud between the two parties because both sides were Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majmain. We'll continue with this part inshallah later. I want to go back to what I talked about of how he did not like high positions. The governor of Basra offered him a position as a judge. He was in a situation where he could not say no, he could not say yes. So he used a strategy where he said yes, and he was just looking for an opportunity where he could just resign right away. That opportunity came to him in the form of this incident. So, Ubaidullah bin Ziyad istiqda Imran ibn Husayn. He asked Imran, this Ubaidullah bin Ziyad was a governor. He asked Imran ibn Husayn to become the Qadi of Basra. He said, okay. And Ubaidullah bin Ziyad was a very cruel man. So it was hard to say no to him without getting your head knocked off. So to save his life, maybe that was the reason why he said, okay. So the first day as a judge, two men came to him, and one of them, whatever they had, a case, a dispute between them, one of them came with a witness. فَقَامَتْ عَلَىٰ أَحَدِهِمَا الْبَيِّنَةِ. So, because he had a witness, Imran ibn Husayn radiallahu anhu judged on his behalf and said that, this case is he's judged in his favor against the other man. And the other man was very unhappy because the bayyinah apparently happened to be a false witness. So, the man came to Imran ibn Husayn later and he said, قَضَيْتَ عَلَيَّ. You made a judgment against me, وَلَمْ تَأْلُ. And you continued to hold on to that position. In other words, you still hold that position. You didn't retract your judgment. You still hold that position right now, even though إِنَّهَا لَبَاطِل. It was batil. Meaning that bayyinah that man brought was a false witness, and that man himself was a liar, the plaintiff. So Imran ibn Husayn radiallahu anhu, when he heard these words, innaha la batil, this is batil, like this is against the Quran and Sunnah, this is haram. He's saying this to Imran ibn Husayn. You know how far Sahaba would run away from anything that has anything to do with the hellfire, and that's what batil is. So, he said, Allahu alladhi la ilaha illahu. I swear by the one, there's no God beside him. And then he stood up, like jumped up, fawathaba. And he came straight to the governor. And he said, A'zilni anil qada. You have to accept my resignation. I can't be a judge any longer. He said, wait a second, Ya Abu Najid. Wait a second, what happened? Tell me, what's going on? He said, la, I don't want to talk anymore. There's no need to discuss anything. I'm not going to destroy my akhirah for anybody. Not for you, for anybody else. Wallahi alladhi la ilaha illahu la aqdi bayna rajulayn ma abadtullah. For as long as I worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I will never be a judge between two people again. Do what you want. You accept it, fine. You don't accept it, that's up to you. I'm not going to do it. So he got his opportunity, he jumped off, and he resigned. Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim didn't like high positions, any position. They didn't consider themselves worthy of even the lowest position, let alone a high position. But since they were held in such high regard, they were put in such situations like the one that I mentioned. So it's mentioned in another incident that once Ziyad, another governor, he sent a man to Imran ibn Husayn to appoint him as the governor of the region known as Khurasan. Khurasan is a very important place that we should know about because it's mentioned in many ahadith that Dajjal will rise from Khurasan. Right? So this Khurasan place is something we should know about now too. Anyhow, he refused. Imran ibn Husayn said, I don't want anything to do with it. So some of the companions and students of Imran ibn Husayn said, Atarakta Khurasan an takuna aliha? Are you refusing a position, such a high position, being appointed as the governor of the whole of Khurasan? Like if they were in that position, they would have jumped at it. And he's refusing. I don't want anything to do with it. So what does he say? He says, Inni wallah. Wallahi al-azim ma yasurruni an asla biharriha wa yuslona bibardiha. I don't want it to be that I become the governor and I take the heat for becoming the governor while they take the coolness from my being governor. In other words, they benefit, but I get all the harm. The harm is that once I get into that position, what happens when people get into positions? When people are given high status or given respect, it ruins their deen, it ruins their iman, they become vain. Their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes weak. And fame is a killer of iman. That's why we say, don't come in front of the camera. Because fame will kill you, right? So he says, I put myself in a position where I'll be a benefit of the people, so people get coolness through my governorship. But what do I get out of it? I take the heat, meaning I go to Jahannam. I can't do that. Why should I benefit people and put myself in harm's way? So this was the way of thinking of the Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim ajma'in. If you look at it now, when we talk about giving da'wah to people, right? We talk about benefiting people as much as possible, bringing people to Islam. But we never look at, are we following the Sharia and the rules of the deen and the principles of deen in regards to how to give da'wah and what things are okay and what things are not okay, right? We've heard stories where a person shook hands with a woman and said, you have to do these things for da'wah. And you hear all sorts of different stories, and even beyond that, right? You hear all sorts of different forms of ijtihad, right? People don't like to follow madhabs because they have their own madhab. And they say all sorts of different things because they're thinking about everybody else, but they're not thinking about themselves and their own deen. But the Sahaba Ridwanullah alayhim ajma'in always looked out for their own deen before they looked out for anybody else, right? So to my detriment, why should I give benefit to others? Yes, if I can benefit other people and it's beneficial for me, bismillah, it works for both of us. But if it doesn't benefit me, it's to my detriment and it harms my deen, it harms my iman, it harms my akhirah, I don't care if it benefits people or not. I have to look at my own self. I have to answer for my own self first in front of Allah on the Day of Judgment. These people are not going to answer for me. So, if they're not going to answer for me and they're not going to be there by my side to protect me against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then why should I sit here and put myself in that situation? Inni akhafu, this is what he says now. إِذَا كُنْتُ فِي نَحْرِ الْعَدُوِّ, if I'm stuck in a situation, أَنْ يَأْتِيَنِي بِكِتَابٍ مِّن زِيَادٍ, that a letter comes to me from the governor, Ziyad, the one who wants to appoint him as the governor of Khurasan. فَإِنْ أَنَا مَضَيْتُ هَلَكْتُ, if I execute his law or his order, I'll be destroyed in the akhirah. وَإِنْ رَجَعْتُ, and if I return, in other words, I refuse to accept his order, ضُرِبَتْ عُنُقِي, my throat gets cut. So I'm stuck in a hard situation. Either I destroy my akhirah or I destroy my deen. Why should I put myself in a hard situation? I don't need it. Do we think like that anymore? Right? We get so happy when we hear about, there's a Muslim who's running for, some seat as a Democrat or as a Republican or something, right? We get so happy that we have some form of representation in the government now, right? But they should be looking out for themselves, that I don't want to be putting myself in a position where I'll be causing the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and destroying my akhirah. And that's bound to happen if you're working in this type of a corrupt system. Because it's not an Islamic-based system. It's not a moral-based system. It's a capitalistic system. It's based on dunya, pure dunya. It's pure secular, right? So all they're looking out is for what people want, whether it's good or bad, irrespective of that. Doesn't matter. Majority matters, and majority decides what's right and what's wrong. But that's not what Islam says. If you follow most of the people in the world, what will they do? Take you away from the straight path. So he refused. On another occasion, he not only did not accept the position himself that he was offered to him, he didn't allow other people to take high positions as well. So there was a man from the tribe of Abu Dharr Ghifari Radiallahu Anhu. Okay, Abu Dharr Ghifari, we all know this great Sahabi of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Somebody from his tribe, I don't know if he was a Sahabi or not, but he was obviously a very respected person. Ziyad, who was, I mentioned, the governor, or we don't know what his exact position was, but he was a powerful man at that time. He appointed this person from the tribe of Ghifar. He's known as Ghifari in the narration, as a commander of all the armed forces at that time. So Imran ibn Husayn comes to this Ghifari to pay him a visit. Right? So this man meets Imran ibn Husayn, and obviously, this is Imran ibn Husayn, Sahabi of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, so he listens to what he has to say. He met him at a time when this Ghifari man was sitting in a gathering of people. So Imran ibn Husayn came to him in that gathering, and then he spoke out loud for everybody to hear and for him to hear. He said, "Atadri lima jittuk." Do you know why I have come to you right now? I'm an old man. It's hard for me to go from one place to another, but I came to you right now. Do you know why I came? He said, "Lima, why?" He said, "Do you remember," which means that this is a Sahabi of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. "Atadhkuru," actually, it doesn't necessarily prove that he's a Sahabi of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Maybe that he knew this narration, so he's reminding him that you know this narration, why are you doing this? Anyhow, "Atadhkuru qawla Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam lirrajuli alladhi qala lahu amiru irmi nafsaka fin nar fa'udrika fahtubisa." So he's reminding this person from Banu Ghifar, appointed by Ziyad. There was an incident that took place in the time of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, where Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam appointed a Sahabi as a leader of an expedition. This expedition went out. For some reason, some issue happened between the Amir and some of the people in the expedition. He got very angry. And he said, dig a trench. They dug a trench. He said, light it up with fire. They lit it up with fire. And then he said, what is the order of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? You have to follow your Amir or no? Yes. Okay. Throw yourself in the trench. Kill yourself, in other words. So people started saying, we became Muslims so we save ourselves from the hellfire. And here he's throwing us in the fire over here. What should we do? So they start talking to each other and finally decided, no, we were not going to go with that. By that time, the Amir, who was really angry at that time, now he's cooled down. He's like, no, I'm just joking. Okay, forget it. Now they went back. They came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and narrated the whole story of what happened. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if any one of them would have jumped into that trench and committed suicide, لَدَخَلَ النَّارَ جَمِيعًا. They all would have entered into the hellfire. The Amir and the people who jumped. Why? لا طاعة في معصية الله تبارك وتعالى. لا طاعة في معصية الله تعالى. There's no obedience in disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're being obedient to Amir but being disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's not obedience. If your parents tell you something that's against the order of Allah, and you follow it, that's not obedience to your parents. That's also disobedience. Because it's disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That comes first. So now, Imran ibn Husayn Radiallahu Anhu is reminding this Ghifari person, maybe a Sahabi, may not be a Sahabi, about this incident. You remember this narration? Yes. So he's saying, yes, I remember. He said, إِنَّمَا رَأْتَ نَذْكُرُكَ هَذَا الْحَدِيث. I just want to remind you of this hadith, that's all. You know what he's saying? You know this position that you're holding right now? It's a very dangerous position you're holding. Why? Because there's going to come a point in time where Ziyad is going to ask you to do something for him. And if you obey him and you'll be disobedient to Allah, and you're thinking, I'm following the Amir, I'm doing the thing that I'm supposed to do. In reality, you're deceiving yourself because there's no obedience to the Amir in disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you're going to go into the hellfire. Therefore, he's saying in a very nice way, resign. Don't do this. Don't take this position. Obviously, he must have had some type of close relationship with this person, or because people had respect for Imran ibn Husayn, therefore they're willing to listen to his nasiha. So he came and advised him that, you know what, this is not good for you. This is dangerous for your iman, it's dangerous for your akhirah. I just want to remind you of the hadith. He didn't say anything further. Just want to remind you of this hadith. Now it's for you to connect the dots and understand what he is trying to say and resign from the position. Once Ziyad, after he resigned from as a judge, Ziyad wanted to appoint him as a collector of zakah. Again, he was in a situation where he couldn't say no. He said, okay. So Imran ibn Husayn went to one place wherever he was sent out, and he collected the zakah, and he came back to Ziyad, and he didn't have a single penny on him. So Ziyad asked him, Ain al-mal? Where's the money? You went to collect zakat, you come empty-handed. What did I send you for? He said, Lil mali arsaltani? You sent me to collect mal for you? He said, Akhadnaha kama kunna na'khudu ala hadi Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I did what we used to do when we used to collect zakah in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What did we do in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? وَوَضَعْنَاهَا فِي الْمَوْضِعِ الَّذِي كُنَّا نَضَعُهَا عَلَى هَدِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم. We used to take that money where we were supposed to take it from the rich, and give it where we were supposed to give it. To the poor, I took it from the rich, I gave it to the poor. What do you want? You don't get any share in it. Zakat is not meant for you. He immediately said, okay, bismillah, go. We don't need you as a zakat collector anymore. Now, when it came to the issue of going back to that position that I mentioned, I promised I would come back to, is the issue between the two parties of Sahaba. On one side, Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu anha, Talha bin Ubaidullah, Zubair ibn al-Awwam, and other Sahaba. And on the other side was Ali ibn Abi Talib, Ammar bin Yasir, and other great Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majma'in. Both sides, great Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majma'in, getting into this lot of dispute that was leading up to a big battle eventually. So somebody came and asked Imran ibn Husayn, and he was right in the middle of it because Basra was the main centers where all the army of Aisha Siddiqa, and not army, but supporters of Aisha Siddiqa and Talha bin Ubaidullah were gathered. So he had to take a stand at some point. People are going to ask him, are you going to side with us or are you against us? What are you doing? So he said at that point, he said, وَدِدْتُ أَنِّي رَمَادٌ تَذْرُونِي الرِّيَاحِ. I wish I was just ashes and the wind would blow me away. It's a very hard position because I don't want to shoot an arrow or swing a sword on either side because on both sides are great people. It's a very difficult task because they're thinking, remember Sahaba thought in terms of akhirah, I'm going to swing a sword and I'm going to hit another person, whether it's a Sahabi or not, he's still a believer. How am I going to answer Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment for that? So what he did was, people kept on coming to him and asking him, what is your position on the matter? Are you going to side with Mu'mineen or no? Because most of the people in Basra were on her side, whereas most of the people in Kufa were on the side of Ali radiallahu anhu. So Imran ibn Husayn did not come out of his house. He sent a man to go to the masjid, and he said, when they're all gathered there at the time of Asr, I want you to stand up and make this announcement. So this man made this announcement. He stood up once the Salatul Asr was finished, all the people were there, and he said, Arsalani ilaykum Imran ibn Husayn. Imran ibn Husayn has sent me to you, and he is Sahibu Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, a great companion of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Yaqra alaykum as-salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. He gives you his salam. Wa yukhbirukum, and he wants to inform you, anni lakum nasihun, that he is sincere in this advice that he wants to inform you of. This nasiha that he wants to give you. Wa yahlifu billah, and he swears by Allah, alladhi la ilaha illahu, besides whom there is no other God. لأن يكون عبدا حبشيا مجدعا يرى أعنزا حضنيات في رأس الجبل حتى يدركه الموت أحب إليه من أن يرمي في أحد من الفريقين بسهم أخطأ وصابه. If there was a Habshi slave that grazed she-goats at the peak of a mountain until death came upon him, he would love to be working and living under him then, or be with him, more than he would like to shoot an arrow against any one of these two parties, whether that arrow hits its target or it doesn't. In other words, I would rather be in the position of the Abdan Habshiyan and just living on my own with my herd of goats, but I would not want to shoot a single arrow on one side or another against the other party where I shoot and it hits its target or it doesn't, because I don't want to shed the blood of a believer. Therefore, his position in this matter was, he's not going to get involved. He's not going to get involved. And so he didn't. And then he said, فَأَمْسِكُوا فِدَلَّكَ بِأَبِي وَأُمِّي. Now he's begging his people, this community. He says, I ask you and I beg you, I ransom my father and mother for you. Please do not take part in this battle on either side. So the people were sitting down with their heads low. فَرَفَعَ الْقَوْمُ رُؤُوسَهُمْ. They raised their heads, obviously out of respect for him. They didn't say anything, and they kept their heads low and listened. And then they said to the messenger, who was a young boy, he said, دَعَنَا مِنْكَ. Please go. Wallah, la nada'u thufla Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam abada. We will not leave the wife of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, our mother, for anybody. In other words, we will support her and we'll be by her side. Now what happened after that, the battle took place. Of those people who were in that congregation, there were over 80 hufaz and qurra and fuqaha. They were all martyred in that battle. Plus the number of others who were not hafiz were even greater. So Imran ibn Husayn radiallahu anhu would cry that they didn't make my nasiha, and look, they were martyred in the battlefield. And the worst thing about it was, the people who martyred them were also believers. So he always cried about the fact that in this situation, the best thing was to just withdraw and not be involved at all. That was his position, and that was also the position of many of the great Sahaba like Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, did not get involved. Most of the Sahaba did not get involved, but there were other Sahaba who were on one side or the other. Which reminds me, and I'll finish with this, there was a dua that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made for Amir Muawiyah radiallahu. There was a battle between Amir Muawiyah and Ali radiallahu. So he made the dua, Allahumma mahdi, Allahumma ja'alhu hadiyan mahdiyan wahdi bihi. There's a dua that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made for Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. When Ali radiallahu anhu, after the battle of Siffin, found out about this narration, this dua, he said, had I known before, I would never have fought him in battle. But at the same time, there's a dua that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made for Ali ibn Abi Talib. Very interesting dua. He said, Allahumma adir al-haqqa haythu ma kana. Oh Allah, put haqq wherever Ali is. Right? Always put him on the side of haqq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted both duas. Both of them were guided, but haqq was with Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. They both had the duas of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They both are respected and beloved to all of us. We don't get involved in making criticism of any one of the two parties. It's too dangerous for our iman, too dangerous for our akhirah. We should be more rather than gossiping and talking about those type of controversies. It's more important for us to be focused on our relationship and building our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is precisely what the position of Imran and Husayn was, is that don't get involved in this stuff, don't get involved in this controversy, because you're going to end up doing something or saying something that's not good for your akhirah. Obviously, if they were swinging their swords against each other, imagine how much they were using their tongues against each other. It's not good for your akhirah. You're going to say something against al-Mu'mineen. You're going to say something against Ali ibn Abi Talib, who, in the words of Imran ibn Husayn himself, that looking at him is even a form of ibadah. And you're going to destroy your akhirah. May Allah protect us against saying anything or feeling anything against the Sahaba Ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in, because love for Sahaba is love for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, just like love for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us death in the state of love for Sahaba, love for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a very beautiful dua related to this. Allahumma inni as'aluka hubbak. Oh Allah, I ask you for your love. Wa hubba man yuhibbuk, and the love of those who love you. Wal amal alladhi yuballighuni hubbak, and such amal that will take me to your love, increase my love for you. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, salamun al mursaleen, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakumullah khairan.